In the spring of 1935, the financial heart of Asia stopped beating. If you stood outside Shanghai's banks before the sun even came up, you wouldn't see ordinary customers making deposits. You'd see massive, desperate crowds trying to rip their money out before the doors opened. Within weeks, businesses that had survived for generations were shutting down. The price of everyday goods crashed. Credit simply vanished. Shanghai was experiencing an economic plague with no obvious domestic origin. There were no new Chinese tax laws, no internal bank failures, and the looming war with Japan had not yet reached the city's financial district. The collapse was triggered 7,000 miles away, inside the United States Senate, by a handful of lawmakers from silver mining states and a president who needed their votes. This localized political trade would eventually reach into every bank vault in China, initiating a massive drain of the country's physical money supply and forcing a radical shift in how the nation defined wealth. To see why China was exposed to a Nevada mining bill, we have to rewind to the 16th century, when Spain discovered staggering deposits of silver in Peru and Mexico. Almost all roads for that metal eventually led to one place. Spanish galleons, massive ships like this, sailed across the Pacific, trading raw silver for Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea. The Ming Dynasty restructured its economy to require taxes to be paid in physical silver instead of grain or labor. Historians call this the single whip law. For roughly 300 years, between a third and a half of all of the silver pulled out of the earth globally eventually ended up sitting inside China's borders as physical ingots like these. By the 20th century, the rest of the world's major economies, Britain, France, the United States, had built their currencies around gold. China was the last major holdout still standing solely on a silver standard. A Chinese yuan was a physical silver coin, valued by the exact weight of the metal it contained. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, gold-backed economies suffered brutal deflation, but silver was quietly losing value against gold, because China's exports suddenly became highly competitive, while the global economy contracted. Relying on physical silver accidentally gave Shanghai a natural shock absorber during the early Depression years, but it also meant that China's entire money supply was permanently chained to the whims of the global commodity market. Back in Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt was attempting to build a massive legislative coalition to pass his New Deal. To get his recovery agenda through the Senate, he needed votes. A small, vocal bloc of senators from western mining states, like Nevada, Idaho, and Montana, had one specific demand. They wanted the federal government to prop up the price of silver to save their local mining jobs. They were backed by decades of free silver populist history, a movement that pitted rural miners against Eastern bankers. By the 1930s, men like Nevada Senator Key Pittman commanded enough votes to stall Roosevelt's entire agenda if their local demands were ignored. In June 1934, Roosevelt gave them what they wanted and signed the Silver Purchase Act. This forced the United States Treasury to aggressively buy silver on the open international market until prices hit a high government target. The United States deployed its enormous financial weight to manipulate a global commodity entirely to appease a few senators from sparsely populated states. Nobody in that room factored in what a massive spike in silver prices would do to China.
This chart shows exactly what happens when the U.S. Treasury throws its weight around. The buying pressure caused an immediate vertical spike in the global price of silver. If you are a global trader holding silver in Shanghai, the math was suddenly very simple. You could pull that physical silver out of Chinese vaults and sell it into the rising market the U.S. was creating abroad, pocketing the massive difference. Within months, a massive flight of capital began. Smuggling networks popped up overnight, ferrying millions of ounces of physical silver out through Hong Kong and other ports to chase premium American prices. Because China's currency was literal physical silver, every ounce loaded onto a ship was money disappearing from the Chinese economy. The money supply contracted violently, banks stopped lending, credit dried up, and a textbook deflationary spiral took hold. Through pure market mechanics, a domestic political favor in Washington effectively siphoned the lifeblood out of a foreign financial system. The nationalist government in China was trapped. As long as their currency remained physical silver, they could not fight the bottomless buying power of the U.S. Treasury. By November 1935, China had to make a desperate choice to stop the bleeding. They officially abandoned the silver standard and ordered citizens and banks to surrender all physical silver to the state. In exchange, the government issued a brand new paper currency called the Fopy. Instead of physical metal in a vault, Chinese money was now backed solely by a managed exchange rate and the government's promise. In the short term, this clever fiat pivot stopped the bank runs and stabilized trade. But in doing so, it also permanently severed the single physical limit that had always restricted the government's ability to print money. Then the war came. In 1937, full-scale conflict broke out with Japan, forcing the nationalist government into a desperate multi-front war for survival that required immense amounts of capital, fast. Under the old silver standard, military spending would have been strictly limited by the physical metal in the treasury, but with a fiat system, the government could bypass slow tax collection and simply print staggering quantities of paper Fopy to fund their armies. This triggered a hyperinflation doom loop. By the late 1940s, prices were doubling in a matter of days. A lifetime of savings became worthless in weeks, and citizens were forced to spend their wages the minute they received them just to buy basic groceries. An unconstrained printing press, originally adopted to save the banking system from American silver policies, ultimately incinerated the wealth of the Chinese public. Economic historians point to this exact crisis as a critical breaking point. By failing to protect the value of the currency, the nationalist government fatally eroded whatever public trust they had left. A population whose savings have been wiped out is rarely loyal to the state that printed the money. That evaporated trust became a fatal vulnerability, tipping the scales of the resulting civil war toward the Chinese Communist Party. By 1949, the nationalist government had collapsed on the mainland entirely, retreating to Taiwan and cementing the geopolitical map of modern China. Today, silver is surging again, driven by industrial demand and central bank hoarding. The underlying mechanics have not changed since 1934. When a major power causes a physical asset to spike in value, the interconnected plumbing of global finance guarantees that somewhere across the globe, a vulnerable economy is quietly being dragged toward a crisis.